Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, my name's Izzy and I like to grow cool to hot orchids here in my apartment in Sydney. Today I'd love to talk to you about Phalaenopsis orchids. So Phalaenopsis are a genus of about 70 species of plants in the orchid family. In the wild, Phalaenopsis orchids are found in India, China, Southeast Asia, New Guinea and Australia, with the majority of them being found in Indonesia and the Philippines. They are also commonly known as moth orchids because the shape of their flower resembles a moth in flight. And this name actually comes from the ancient Greek word phalaena, which means a kind of moth, with the suffix opsis, which means to have the appearance of or be like. They are one of the most commonly found orchids that you'll see in supermarkets, in Bunnings, or other hardware stores, and they're often commonly bought for people as gifts. They're taken home, their beautiful flowers are nice and long lasting, but when the flowers fade, they're often forgotten about, or they're overwatered, they end up dying, and then sadly everyone forgets about their beautiful Phalaenopsis and they're known to never rebloom again, and they're seen as one of those that are really difficult to care for when they're actually not. So today we're going to chat a little bit about potting medium, the temperature and light requirements that phals like, as well as watering and reblooming. So as with any orchid, it's really important to know where they grow naturally in the wild, and that will help you mimic their requirements so that they can thrive in your own environment. So Phalaenopsis are epiphytes, which means they predominantly grow on trees without harming the plant or the tree themselves. They'll attach their aerial roots to the bark of a tree and hold on, and that's how they will also absorb nutrients and water. They can also be found growing in rocks and crevices, particularly near rivers and streams. Phalaenopsis orchids are tropical plants, which means they prefer to grow in warmer temperatures. So during the day, they generally like a range between 18 to 28 degrees, and overnight sort of around 15 to 18 degrees. That's why most of the time you'll see people growing Phalaenopsis indoors like mine are, as opposed to outdoors, unless you live in northern Australia or somewhere nice and warm and tropical and nice and humid for them, then in that case they will thrive outside. So to start off with, potting medium. So we know that they grow on trees generally in nature, or on rocks and crevices, as I mentioned. So they do like their roots to be quite aerated. A lot of the issues people generally have with Phalaenopsis actually has to do with overwatering them. So generally, if you're picking it up from a hardware store or a supermarket, most of the time they'll come in a clear tube with sphagnum moss, which is really water retentive. Now, sphagnum moss can be great in certain circumstances. So for example, the supermarkets that have them growing in sphagnum moss, that's great for them because it generally means they don't have to water them the whole time that they're on sale for. The moss will keep nice and moist and retain the moisture, which means the roots will be constantly having an uptake of moisture without getting too soaked all the time, and it will take a really long time to dry off. So by the time someone purchases one, takes it home, it shouldn't be too dehydrated theoretically. However, if you do keep them in the sphagnum moss when you get home and you're watering them every so often and not allowing the sphagnum moss to dry out adequately, this is how you then are led to overwatering and root rot, that sort of thing. So once they've finished flowering, because generally they're sold when they're in flower, once that flower spike is finished and faded, that's when your orchid needs you most of all. It's just used all its energy on producing beautiful blooms for you, and now it needs to be supported as it returns to active growth. And this is when roots generally become suffocated by the sphagnum moss. So they're being overwatered too much, the roots are covered in water, they can't absorb it all, they start to rot. Then your orchid starts to look a little bit dehydrated. So you might get these leaves looking all wrinkled and you think, oh, it's dehydrated, I'll water it some more. But it can only take up so much water, and if there's no roots, you're not going to be able to rehydrate your orchid. So when I bring my Phalaenopsis home, if they are in sphagnum moss, I like to repot them into a nice, healthy, chunky mix of orchid bark, like chunky orchid bark, perlite, and a tiny bit of sphagnum moss. By a tiny bit of sphagnum moss, I'll show you in a minute, but basically I mean just a couple of flecks of sphagnum moss throughout the mix, mixed in, so that the mix does retain a little bit more moisture than if it was just bark, but it's not going to be suffocating any of the roots. It's just mainly to help the orchid. Chunky bark keeps it nice and aerated so that the roots can dry out and have a little bit of air around them. And the perlite helps to retain a little bit of moisture, but also helps to keep the mix a bit more aerated. I also do like to pot all of my phals in a nice clear pot like this one. I do this for a couple of reasons. Reason number one being I can see all the roots and see when they need to be watered, which I'll explain in a minute. I can also see the medium and the color of the medium, so if it's darker, I know it's still wet. And you can also see moisture in the pot. So you can see the moisture against the edges of the pot, so I'll be able to have a really clear indication of if my orchid needs watering or not. You can see here I've actually just watered this Phalaenopsis an hour or so ago. You can see sort of the water on the edges, you can see it's nice and dark in there. You can't really see too many roots on this one, but I'll show you a couple of them in a minute. But it is really helpful, particularly if you're starting out, but also if you're quite experienced with orchids. It's nice and easy. It gives you a quick visual of how your orchid's doing and whether or not it requires watering. So in terms of when to water Phalaenopsis, the easy, simple answer is when it becomes dry. So if you think about where they grow naturally in the wild on trees, they'll have rain pour all over them, drench their roots, drench the bark. They'll have a little bit of time to absorb it from the bark, absorb any nutrients as well, and then they'll quite quickly dry off because their roots are open to the air. Phalaenopsis are nice and easy, I think, when it comes to learning when it needs to be watered. The roots will actually quite clearly and obviously change color, which will give you an indication of whether or not they need to be watered. So if your Phalaenopsis roots are like this one, you can see they're quite silvery on there. I'll give you a couple of other close-up shots that I've taken to show you a bit more of a clear example. But if they're silvery in color or gray otherwise, that means they need watering. But if they're nice and green, like this one, which I've just recently watered, nice and green in color, that means they don't need to be watered, or they've just recently been watered. So silvery equals needs water, green equals doesn't need water. It's also really important to check the mix. If the mix looks nice and dry, then it needs watering. If it's still wet or a little bit wet, maybe give it a couple more days. Phalaenopsis are quite forgiving with underwatering as opposed to overwatering. So if you're not sure, hold off a few extra days. They'll be fine. They're quite drought tolerant. It's just more if you water them too often, that's when their roots struggle. They'll begin to suffocate, and then you'll have a very sad orchid that might be on the way even further downhill. Normally I find in my growing conditions, I generally water my phals every 7 to 10 days. It also depends on what phase of growth they're in. If they're in active growth, maybe they'll need watering a bit closer to that 7-day mark. If they're in a little bit of dormancy that can happen at certain times throughout the year, then maybe they need watering every 10 to 12 to 14 days or so, give or take. But looking at the roots, checking the medium, even the weight of the pot, you think if it's wet, it'll be heavier. If it's lighter, it'll be drier. Checking everything in conjunction will give you a good indication of, yes, I do need to water, or no, I can hold off a few more days. If you think your orchid might look dehydrated, it's really important to check, is it dehydrated because it's not getting enough water, which is generally the first thing you think of, or is it dehydrated, like how I said before, because I've been overwatering it, its roots are dying, and it literally doesn't have any roots that it can absorb the water with anymore because they're all dead. You can notice dehydration in a number of different ways. So one of the first ways you'll see is the leaves will look quite limp. They might even be a little bit wrinkled, which can be a sign of dehydration, or their roots might be really sort of that silvery grey colour, but also really shriveled up, not nice and plump looking. But just remember, if you do have rotten roots, no matter how often you water that orchid, it will not become rehydrated. Another important thing to check for if you're not sure if the phal needs watering is algae deposits. So potting the phals in that clear pot is fantastic, but having the roots and the medium open to more light can create algae and encourage a little bit of algae to grow. It shouldn't be anything too severe. If it is, you might need to reconsider how you pot them or grow them for your own conditions. But for example, this orchid, this came to me in this cup that someone had potted the seedling in, and I did notice it has actually created a fair amount of algae in there, which can sit on the roots and make the roots look green when they're actually really dehydrated and silver underneath, but it's just the algae sitting on top of the roots or on the edge of the pot that makes it look green. So you might be tempted to say, oh no, that orchid doesn't need watering, but it actually does. So just check for algae deposits. You'll be able to hopefully see this. Maybe not. Let me just bring a little light over here for you. Don't know if you can see that. See how there's algae growing in there, and it's actually sitting on some of the roots. So I have actually also watered this one fairly recently, but you can see how it is a little bit confusing, and it can make your roots look nice and green. In terms of time of day to water, some people will say this is a myth, some people go with it. I've just rolled with it because logically it seems to make sense to me. I like to water as early in the morning as I can, as opposed to in the evening, just because temperatures are normally a bit warmer during the day. Helps the water to evaporate a bit quicker if there's any water on the leaves or in the crown, which you should try to avoid. It just means that they're not going to be cold and wet overnight if the temperatures are a little bit cooler. At the end of the video, I'll also show you how I like to water my Phalaenopsis and the equipment that I use to do so, so stick around to the end if you'd like to see that as well. In terms of temperature, as I mentioned before, they are more tropical growers, so they do like that daytime temperature of 18 to 28 degrees and a bit of a drop overnight. For example, inside here at the moment, it's 22 degrees and 64% humidity. So that's outside, that's inside. So about 22.7 it is at the moment, to be precise. But they generally like temperatures that if you're comfortable in your own home, your Phalaenopsis will be comfortable as well. However, in terms of blooming, to encourage them to bloom, they do need a drop in the nighttime temperature. So distinguished cool down from daytime to nighttime will actually promote them to grow flower spikes. Phalaenopsis orchids will generally bloom from late winter to sort of early to mid-spring. So they'll start to actually develop those flower spikes in late autumn or early winter. The cool down in the period from summer to autumn will actually cause the orchids to realize that temperatures are cooling down. It might be time to start actually thinking about growing your flower spike. So that autumn period is particularly important when it comes to making sure they do get that nighttime cool down so that they are encouraged to grow their flower spikes. Now this is a lot easier than it sounds to do. Basically, mine, you can see behind me, we've got a big window here. This is our window to our balcony. We actually hang some orchids off the top of the blinds, so we don't close the blinds at night time anymore because we've got too many plants now. But basically having them close enough to a window that you do get a little bit of a cool down from outside, as opposed to being in the middle of a room or against a couple of walls where it's a bit more insulated. Just having a window there, they do experience a bit more of a cool down overnight than you'd get in the middle of the room, say. And we actually had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 phals, which are all our sort of bigger than seedling Phalaenopsis. All 10 of them popped out multiple flower spikes. Just from that, we didn't move them. They're literally sitting there or on the shelf just next to me, and they all spiked. So it's nothing really difficult. It's literally just where you position them. Just make sure they can experience a little bit of a change in daytime to nighttime temperature as you're in that sort of autumn period, and then you'll be rewarded with amazing blooms. So what I'd recommend in terms of placement, pop it near a window, as I said, or if it's in a room like your lounge room or something, if you can open a little window, or if you've got a sliding door to a balcony or anything like that, just pop it near that, crack it open a little bit overnight just to get a little bit of a cool breeze. They don't want to be in sort of windy conditions or necessarily put outside where they'll be freezing cold, but just a little bit of a drop is perfect. In terms of light requirements, Phalaenopsis need a lot less light than say an Oncidium or a lot of different types of orchids, but this doesn't mean that they can grow in the dark. They still need light to photosynthesize, and light will also help to keep the plant nice and healthy and feed the leaves and feed the flowers and buds to make sure it gives you beautiful blooms year after year. One thing they don't like is direct sun. So if you're putting your Phalaenopsis on a window, just make sure it's not getting direct sun in the morning or direct sun in the afternoon, or let alone the middle of the day, because this will actually burn the leaves, and it will also damage the flowers, but it can cause so much harm to your orchid that it will actually die. So when you think of light for Phalaenopsis, just think of bright shade. So you can see up here, I grow mine on a little shelf or a couple of little shelves. Some of the shelves do have grow lights. They don't necessarily need grow lights though, or really strong grow lights. It just happens to be that I'm growing a range of different types of orchids on each shelf, so some of them need more light than others. These grow lights aren't going to burn the leaves of the Phalaenopsis though, as opposed to the heat and the intensity of the direct sun. So just having lights around, or having them on the top shelf like this one, where it gets a little bit of light from the balcony. This is northeast facing balcony. That's a perfect amount of light, bright shade, that's all they need. So when your Phalaenopsis do actually start producing flower spikes, now is the time that you can switch over to your bloom fertilizer. So fertilizing your orchid actually will provide it with the macro and micronutrients that it needs to grow and survive and produce flowers and support the flower spikes and support long-lasting flowers for you. There are a couple of different ways that you can fertilize your Phalaenopsis. Generally, it's either a liquid or a powder fertilizer. I generally prefer to use a powder fertilizer, mainly because it's more economical, particularly if you're like me and you've got quite a few orchids to fertilize. One thing to keep in mind though with the powder fertilizers is they are what you call hygroscopic, which means they will absorb water from the air. So I like to keep mine in containers and only sort of open it, quickly pop the fertilizer in and then shut the container again, because if you leave the container open to the air, it'll absorb any of the moisture in the air and it gets quite yucky and sort of not wet, but it feels a bit damp and a bit sticky type thing. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. I like to fertilize my phals generally each time I water them. I find they do quite well with that. I fertilize them weekly, like a week concentration of fertilizer, roughly about once a week, depending on how often they need to be watered and how quickly they've dried out from the last time. And generally when they start to spike, that's when I will switch over to a bloom fertilizer. I've heard of some people switching over earlier to a bloom fertilizer before they spike to sort of encourage them to spike, but that's just how I've done it. I just switch them when I notice them growing flower spikes and I support them from there. But whatever works for you and whatever you've heard is a good idea. And then for the rest of the year, I'll generally if they're in active growth, I'll just use the growth fertilizer just to support their growth of new leaves, nice and healthy roots, so that then they're a nice bigger, better, healthier plant to grow bigger and better flowers and flower spikes for the following season. Something that's really important to note and that a lot of people don't think about is Phalaenopsis don't go dormant after they've finished blooming. As soon as that flower spike is finished, they don't just sit there and sort of dwell in their own sort of no floweriness. They do go into active growth. So this is the prime time that you need to support your orchid. The time when they've actually finished flowering, as opposed to when they have flowers, is the time that your orchid needs you the most. You need to support its growth. You need to make sure it's getting watered adequately, not too much, not too little, so that it can be ready for the next season. I'll just touch on a little bit of blooming care or reblooming care. So Phalaenopsis flowers can last for a couple of months, generally anywhere from sort of 3 to 6 months, or if you're luckier, they can last even longer. But generally, if they last longer, it means their current buds, like these ones, will have faded. Their flower spike will most likely stay green, and it might even create new branches from the same flower spike, which will then create new buds and new flowers. So a lot of the time it might be regenerating itself by finishing off some flowers whilst also growing new flowers, and they're opening while the other ones are fading. So they can actually stay in bloom theoretically almost year round. However, if your Phalaenopsis is finishing flowering and you're noticing a change in color of the flower spike, so where have I got one? Actually, I think I already cut it off. I may have even filmed it. But this Phalaenopsis mini mark, this one had 2 flower spikes on it, and it has now got 1. So that means the flower spike that it had on it before, all the flowers faded and the spike actually started to turn sort of a yellowy browny color, and that sort of starts at the tip of the spike and goes all the way to the base of the stem, which basically means if you see that, it's not going to produce any more branches from that same spike. It's finished with that spike and it's getting rid of it. So you can help it on its way by cutting it as close to the base of the orchid as possible. This one also was a tiny little baby seedling when I got it, and it had one, I think it only had 1 flower the first time it bloomed for me. It had some tiny little leaves like these ones, then it grew some bigger leaves like these ones here, and then it started to grow this leaf and then stopped because it was time to bloom, and it did produce 2 spikes, which is fantastic, but I would really like it to work on some growth now. So I will, if this spike doesn't start to fade, once these flowers fade, I'm going to cut it off so that it can focus its energy on growth. The best time to repot your Phalaenopsis is also as soon as they finish blooming. So this one, for example, this is a nice healthy Phalaenopsis. In the wild, they like to grow on trees and they grow facing downwards. So you can see this one is trying to sort of spread itself out and grow downwards and fall out of the pot. So I might even transfer this one to a mount once it's finished blooming. It's still got some flowers on there at the moment, but you can see this other spike, they are sort of all starting to fade. If it wants to focus, yeah, they're all starting to fade a little bit. I can't necessarily see the spike fading itself yet. The spikes still look pretty green, but you can see I did water this one today as well, so it's nice and green. but it's got a lot of roots coming out of the pot as well, which is, it's fine, like it's not terrible, but this particular orchid is also really falling out of this pot. Don't know if you can see there. She's basically out of the pot. She's got a few old dead roots there, from when I first got it, or just after I first got it, I think, but now it's grown all these healthy new beautiful long roots that are mimicking the shape of the pot at the moment. So this one, once it finishes blooming, or once the flowers fade, I'll probably cut off both spikes and then repot it so that it can then focus on growing, getting settled into its new pot, getting a bit bigger, and then it will be in bloom again hopefully next season. So when you're purchasing any Phalaenopsis from the supermarket or a hardware store, or if you found an orchid nursery that has lots of nice Phalaenopsis that you'd like to get, there's a couple of things you should look out for. You should be aiming to choose the most healthy plant as opposed to the orchid with the most flowers or the most flower spikes. Having heaps of flower spikes, that's obviously a bonus, and it's beautiful, and you want your orchid obviously to have as many flower spikes as it possibly can handle. But if you've got an orchid that's been over fertilized because it's been in a nursery and they've pumped it full of bloom booster and it's pumped out all these spikes, it may not actually have any healthy roots. So once those spikes are finished and the flowers are finished, your orchid might die, and then you won't have those beautiful flowers. So the first thing you want to check is the health of the actual plant, the leaves, and particularly the roots. You want to find one that has nice and healthy roots. You don't want to look at the roots and they're all shriveled or they're all brown and squishy and dead, because your plant won't actually be able to sustain itself. So pick up the pot, see if you can see the roots. You're mainly wanting to check as well the roots that you can sort of see inside the pot, so hopefully it is in something clear that you can have a little bit of a look. If you can't see any roots, maybe go through a couple and see if you can find some with some roots so you can check that it looks healthy. They will also a lot of the time have some aerial roots, like you can see on this one that I showed you before. That's really good too, but you want to hopefully find one that has roots inside the pot as well, because these roots open to the air, they'll dry out quite quickly, and if there's no roots in the pot, it's not great. You'll just have to be misting that a lot of the time. You want them to have aerial roots and roots inside the pot as well. It is also quite normal for Phalaenopsis to drop their leaves. You just don't want them to be dropping their fresh new leaves that they've just grown, because that can indicate a problem. So for example, this Phalaenopsis, this is a species Phalaenopsis that I showed in one of my recent videos in an orchid haul I did. This one is quite a good example because it's a pretty healthy, keep it in the pot actually, it's a pretty healthy plant itself. It's just got some old leaves that aren't super healthy, but it's normal for them to drop the older leaves so that they can make room for new leaves. So you can see here, or I hope you can see here, these are some of the newest leaves. They're nice and green, nice and healthy. This leaf here, it's actually looking like it's going to drop. It's pretty limp, it's changing color, it's going a bit yellowy, looking like it's dying, and it should just dry up and fall off. However, if I looked at this orchid before buying it and some of these leaves were looking okay, but then it was drying up these two, that's a bit of a red flag. I would just be sort of careful, maybe check the roots, check that it hasn't been overwatered before you got it and things like that. Also, if you notice any weird spotting or dark spots or strange patterns along the leaves, it could indicate a virus or a fungus. So you also just want to be a little bit cautious of that as well. Try and pick ones that look nice and healthy. Their leaves are nice and thick and green. Generally they're dark green, that's a slightly bit of an exception, but pick one that looks nice and healthy and shiny. I'll just go through a couple of little tips before we delve into how I like to water my Phalaenopsis. One of the things is, how do you clean their leaves, and should you clean their leaves? Yes, so if their leaves are looking really dusty and dirty, don't know if you can see this one, I might have to get my little light over here again. Ugh. The camera may or may not pick up on it, but basically this one is sat on a windowsill above my sink, and it has got a little bit of dust. We do have a cat, so it's got a little bit of cat hair sort of sitting on that, so I would want to clean it, because the dirtier the leaves are, the less light they're going to absorb as well, and it can also suffocate the leaves. So when you're cleaning the leaves, all I do is I get a little bit of paper towel and dampen it with a bit of water, squeeze it out so it's not dripping wet, and you just want to gently wipe across the top of the orchid leaf, not on the bottom. The base of the Phalaenopsis leaf is actually where the stomata is, and it can suffocate the plant if you wet it and it stays wet. And so you generally shouldn't need to clean the underside of the leaf anyway, because there shouldn't be too much dust or anything sticking to it, because the top of the leaf should be covering it and collecting most of the dust. So I filmed a couple of clips for you that go through step by step how I like to water my Phalaenopsis orchids. The things I do might be different from how you do it, or the same, or if you're new, it might just give you a good idea and a starting point. But just remember, how you water really needs to depend on your own growing conditions in your own home. So you can watch this and then adapt what I do to suit your growing conditions. So basically when I water, as I said before, I do like to fertilize each time I water. So I'll get my either orchid food soluble fertilizer or the bloom booster soluble fertilizer that I purchase from Bunnings. These ones are the powdered ones, and I generally will use 1 gram per 1 litre of water. I do also have these watering cans, which are also from Bunnings. I feel like I'm doing a Bunnings ad, but this is not an ad in any way, shape or form. But yes, these 2 watering cans with the long spouts from Bunnings. I just find that they're easier. They're better for orchids as well, because you're not going to be having that wide spurt with the lots of little holes, because that will mean you'll probably end up getting water in the crown every time you water, or it'll just be too awkward and all the water will just be spilling out over the edges of the pot, which you don't want as well. But this way you can sort of get the tip nice and close to the pot, nice and close to the base of the orchid. You've got more control over it, and you can control exactly where the water is going and where it's filling to. I do from time to time get water in the crown when I'm watering them, but all you need to do is get a little bit of paper towel, just dab it in the crown, and it should sort of wick up the water. I just sort of wick up a bit, turn the paper towel over to a dry bit, and wick up a bit more until it's as dry as you can get it. You should also try and avoid getting water in between the leaves as well, because it can sort of sit in there similarly and cause the orchid to rot too. In regards to temperature of the water, Phalaenopsis, people say they are super picky, but I wouldn't call it picky. I'd just say, you know, in the wild, it's sort of what they're used to. They're not used to freezing cold, icy water, and they're not used to boiling hot water out of the kettle, for an extreme example. So I just use lukewarm or room temperature water from the tap. I have seen people put ice blocks on their Phalaenopsis as well, and just let them sort of slowly melt. I would really advise against doing this, because you think it's icy cold. That's not what they get in the wild. It can burn their roots, or it can really shock the roots as well, which you don't want. So I wouldn't say it's fussy. I would say that's what nature does, you know. So I just use room temperature water. I'll put the fertilizer in first, fill my watering can up, make sure it's mixed in thoroughly. Generally, I just keep all my Phalaenopsis inside when I water them, and I do use little decorative pots to sit them in. You don't want to just have your orchid potted directly into a decorative pot with nothing else that you can take out, because that makes drainage really hard. You want to sort of have it in an ugly pot, for lack of a better word, like a plastic pot like I've shown you, and then put it inside a decorative pot. I find that's the best way for me. You might find it different from yourself, but that's just what I like to do. So I'll sit them in their little pot. If it's inside, I'll generally put a little tray underneath it to catch sort of any drips, so that the carpet doesn't get wet at all. And I'll put the tip of the watering can nice and close to the base of the orchid, slowly fill it up just to underneath where the leaves are. Because I've got my orchids in a mix that isn't too water retentive, I generally find that my Phalaenopsis orchids do better if I leave them to soak for 10 minutes or so. They're able to take in a bit more water than if I was to just rinse them, and I find that I need to water them less often if I'm soaking them. Once I've filled all the pots up with the water and the fertilizer, I'll set myself a little timer for about 10 minutes. Then once the timer is up, I'll remove the clear pot from the decorative pot, gently tip all of the remaining fertilizer and water into a bucket, and gently tilt the clear pot over the top of the bucket to make sure that the orchid is thoroughly drained and there's no excess water sitting in the pot. After I've done this, most of the time I'll leave them sitting in the decorative pot for another 5 or 10 minutes before draining it again, because most of the time you'll find there'll be another centimetre or so of water that will sort of drain after you've drained the majority of the water. And if that sits in there and sits on the roots for the next 7 to 10 days before you next water, it can cause them to be too water retentive and can start to rot some of the roots. So I just like to do that as a little extra step. Or alternatively, you can just pop them on a little tray outside of the decorative pot back on the shelf, and it should allow them to keep draining without sort of covering your bench or your shelves in water. And then that excess water should hopefully just evaporate and provide a little bit of humidity for the orchid as well. Well, that's everything I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video on Phalaenopsis Care. Please like this video and press subscribe if you'd like to see more of my orchid content, and pop a nice comment down below if you'd like to. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!